The water at Blackwater Lock does not behave like ordinary water. It moves with a slow, heavy certainty, dark as ink beneath the surface, cold even in the warmest months. Standing near the edge, you can feel the temperature change on your skin, as if the river is breathing out a chill that does not belong to the season. By day, the lock appears simple and functional. Weathered wood, iron hardware, damp stone, and a narrow passage where boats pass through in patient silence. The banks are lined with reeds and low trees, their roots twisted into the mud like fingers clinging to the earth. The current slides along the walls, steady and untroubled, as though nothing has ever happened here. The stories begin with sightings along the riverbanks. No movement of the head, no gesture, no sign of impatience. Some visitors wave or call out softly, thinking it might be a local fisherman or a walker lost in thought. Yet the moment the observer blinks or looks away, the figure is gone. No footsteps retreating into brush, no ripples in the water, no sound at all. Only the same empty bank and the same deep, cold flow. Blackwater Lock is not a wide place, but it has the feeling of distance. Sounds stretch strangely across the water. A cough or a whisper can seem louder than it should. A single dropped stone can echo as if the lock is hollow beneath the ground. Even birds sometimes fall quiet when they pass overhead, as though instinct warns them not to linger. In the late afternoon, when sunlight turns low and the shadows lengthen across the platform, the lock becomes a stage set for the imagination. Yet the people who report strange things here are not always thrill seekers. Many come simply to walk, to breathe fresh air, to watch the slow routine of the river. They do not arrive looking for a story. The story finds them instead. It often starts with footsteps. The wooden platforms around the lock are old, reinforced in places, worn smooth by weather and time. They creak naturally under the weight of a person, and anyone who has walked there knows the sound by heart. A familiar groan, a soft complaint, a slow settling of timber. But some evenings, those sounds occur without a cause. A visitor stands near the water, hands in pockets, watching the current slide past. The platform behind them is empty, clear from end to end. And then, from the dry boards, comes the unmistakable rhythm of someone pacing. Step, pause, step. Not running, not dragging, just a measured walk, as if a worker is making rounds, checking ropes and gates, doing a job that must be done. The sound travels in a straight line, approaching, then stopping, as if the unseen walker has reached the edge. People turn quickly, expecting to see a late fisherman or a lock attendant. Sometimes they even apologize, thinking they are blocking the way. But there is nobody there. The boards lie still. The air remains undisturbed. If they stay longer, the footsteps begin again, retreating slowly into nothing. At Blackwater Lock, the most unsettling details are never dramatic. There are no violent shocks, no loud screams, no sudden spectacle. The strangeness here is quiet, almost respectful. It behaves like a memory that refuses to fade. On certain nights, when fog gathers low above the river, another presence is reported. Boatmen, not modern boaters in bright jackets or casual hats, but figures dressed in uniforms that belong to another time. Their outlines are pale and indistinct, as if painted in thin layers of moonlight. Some appear near the lock gates, standing with hands behind their backs. Others seem to bend over the water, focused on ropes that cannot be seen. A visitor might notice them at a distance first, a cluster of shapes where no one was before. A sense of activity in a place that should be still. The viewer's eyes lock onto the scene, trying to understand what they are witnessing. And then the details become impossible. The boatmen move with purpose, but there is no boat. Their hands pull on lines that do not exist. Their posture suggests weight and tension. Yet the water stays smooth, unbroken by any vessel. The lock gates remain closed, unmoving, while the figures continue their silent work as if following an order that was given long ago. Those who watch for too long often describe the same feeling, a quiet pressure in the chest, like standing too close to cold metal in winter. Some report a faint smell of damp cloth, river mud, and old oil, the scent of machinery and worn leather. Others say the air grows heavy, as though the river has drawn the warmth out of the world. Then, without warning, the boatmen fade. Not a sudden disappearance, but a slow thinning, like mist dissolving in a breeze. Their outlines lose definition. Their pale uniforms become nothing more than smudges against the dark, and the lock returns to emptiness, leaving only the soft sound of water moving through stone. It is easy to dismiss such reports as imagination, especially in places where history lingers. But Blackwater Lock has a way of collecting similar experiences from strangers who never compare notes. One person speaks of seeing a lantern glow that floated along the bank without a carrier. Another mentions hearing a soft splash at the exact moment the footsteps stopped, as if someone stepped off the platform into the river. Others describe voices too faint to understand, like distant conversation muffled by fog. Yet none of it feels theatrical. The river at Blackwater Lock has carried countless things: barges and small boats, tools and cargo, stories and secrets. It has carried laughter on bright mornings and silence on stormy nights. It has carried the weight of ordinary days, and it has carried moments nobody wanted to remember. And perhaps that is the heart of the mystery. A lock is designed to control the river, to guide it, to make it behave. Gates open and close. Water rises and falls. Passage is allowed, then stopped. Everything is meant to be measured, practical, safe. But water remembers movement. Water remembers weight. Water remembers what sank, what drifted, and what never made it back to shore. At Blackwater Lock, the deep cold current seems to hold on to more than just reflections. It holds presence. It holds routine. It holds echoes of the people who worked here, waited here, crossed here, and never truly left. When you stand on the wooden platform late at night, listening to the river slide past, you may notice how the darkness does not feel empty. You may feel watched, not with anger, but with a steady attention, like something patient and familiar. The figures on the banks, the footsteps on empty boards, the boatmen tending invisible vessels, they do not chase visitors away. They simply appear, as if the lock is still operating under rules written in another century. And when you finally turn to leave, walking back toward the road, you might hear one last sound behind you, a single creak of wood, a soft step, a pause, as if Blackwater Lock is waiting for the next boat that will never arrive, and the next traveler who will stand at the edge of the deep, cold water, wondering why it feels like the river is staring back. Widow's Lock is a narrow cut in the river where water is forced to obey stone and iron. The channel tightens. The banks rise higher, and the current feels pressed down into something darker and more serious. Even in daylight, the place carries a strange stillness, as if sound travels differently here, as if the air itself pauses to listen. The lock gates stand like quiet barriers, stained by time and weather. The walkways are thin, lined with rails that are cold to the touch. Moss clings to the stone walls, and the wood underfoot holds the imprint of countless steps. Some heavy and working, others slow and unsure. It moves with a careful weight, like it knows the ground beneath it is not only earth, but memory. Locals call it Widow's Lock, and they say the name was earned in the most painful way. Long ago, this lock was the center of daily life. Boats arrived with supplies, workers tightened ropes and checked gates, and families walked the banks to watch the water rise and fall like a controlled heartbeat. The lock was not meant to be dangerous. It was meant to protect, to guide, to keep the river from turning wild. But one evening, something went wrong. The details of the tragedy are told in different ways, because time changes the shape of any story. Some say a warning was shouted and lost in the noise of moving gates and rushing current. What never changes is the number of lives that were taken. The river did what rivers do when given the chance. It pulled, it turned, it claimed what it touched, and when the water finally calmed again, the lock returned to stillness, as if nothing had happened at all. Except something had. A place can be repaired. Wood can be replaced. Stone can be reinforced. Metal can be hammered back into shape. But the weight of a sudden loss does not fade so easily. It settles into the corners, into the spaces where hands once held ropes, into the gaps between boards, into the cold air that collects above the water at night. That is why people who visit Widow's Lock after dark often say the place feels occupied. Not by crowds, not by noise, but by something quiet and present. The first sign is usually the shadows. They appear along the gates, stretched thin across the wood and iron like long figures, standing close together. Sometimes they move as if they are shifting their weight. Sometimes they slide slowly along the edge of the walkway, keeping pace with the visitor, who is trying not to look too directly. Even when the moon is bright and the sky is clear, the shadows at Widow's Lock do not always match the light. They form in places where nothing stands. They lengthen in directions that feel wrong. And when someone turns their head to follow them, the shapes break apart, melting into ordinary darkness. But the visitor is left with the feeling that they were not alone a moment ago. Then come the sounds. It begins softly, almost like a trick of the wind. A thin note of sadness carried across the river. A trembling breath. A faint crying sound that seems to come from the stone walls themselves, as if the lock has learned how to mourn. People stop and listen, trying to place it. They walk closer to the gates, thinking perhaps an animal is trapped somewhere along the bank, or a traveler is calling for help in the distance. Yet the sound does not grow clearer. It stays faint, just beyond understanding, like grief heard through a closed door. Some hear whispers mixed with the crying. Not loud enough to repeat, not clear enough to recognize as words, but present enough to make the skin prickle. The whispers follow the walkways, hugging the rails and the corners where water drips steadily from moss. They feel directed, like someone trying to speak without being overheard. And the most unsettling part is that the whispers often stop the moment a visitor speaks aloud, as if whatever lingers here is listening, waiting, choosing when to be heard. Even the lanterns at Widow's Lock are part of the story. There are nights when the walkways glow with soft flickers of light, warm and golden, appearing one after another like a line of small flames. From a distance, it looks almost welcoming, like someone has come to guide a boat safely through. But when a person approaches, there is no lamp, no glass, no wick, no hanging hook, only light. It trembles along the edges of the walkway, reflecting off wet stone and dark water. Sometimes it floats just above the boards, as if carried by unseen hands. Sometimes it pulses gently, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, like a heartbeat trying to stay steady. People who witness this often describe a strange pressure in the air, a feeling that time has slowed down. The river sounds farther away, even though it is right there. The world beyond the lock feels distant, like the place has folded inward, keeping the visitor inside a pocket of darkness and light. Then the lantern flicker fades, not extinguished in a sudden snap, but thinning the way candlelight looks in fog. The glow becomes weaker, more uncertain, and then it is gone, leaving the walkways empty again. Some visitors leave immediately after that, walking quickly back the way they came, trying not to run, trying to keep dignity, but unable to ignore the instinct to escape. Others stay, drawn by curiosity, unable to accept that the lock can show something that should not exist. Those people often report one final detail, the feeling of someone standing just behind them, not touching, not breathing loudly. They turn fast, expecting to see a person on the walkway, but there is nobody, only the rails, the damp boards, and the steady water below. Yet the feeling remains for several seconds more, as if the unseen presence is slow to move away. Widow's Lock is not a place of loud horror. It does not throw its mystery at visitors like a performance. Its power is quieter, heavier, and more personal. It is the kind of place where you begin to understand that tragedy can leave an imprint, that the river does not only carry boats and branches, but emotions, moments, unfinished goodbyes, that stone walls can hold echoes, That wooden boards can remember the weight of hurried footsteps and desperate hands. And perhaps the name Widow's Lock is not only about what happened once, perhaps it is also about what continues. A lock is built to control the water, to keep movement predictable, to make travel safe. But the past does not always follow rules. The past leaks through cracks, flows beneath the surface, and rises when the world grows quiet. If you ever find yourself there at night, standing near the gates with the river moving slowly below, listen carefully. Watch the shadows. Notice how the air feels colder near the stone. And if you see a soft lantern glow flickering along the empty walkway, do not assume it is meant for you. It might be a light left behind for someone who never made it home, and the lock is simply remembering the way it always has. Mistville Lock is the kind of place you can walk past in daylight and barely notice. A narrow cut in the water, old gates of iron and wood, stone walls darkened by years of rain. It rests quietly in its shallow valley, surrounded by damp earth and low trees that lean toward the river as if listening. But the moment fog arrives, Mistville Lock becomes something else. Mist here does not drift casually like ordinary morning haze. It rolls in with purpose, thick and smooth, sliding across the water in pale waves. It gathers along the banks and clings to the lock walls, wrapping the railings and platforms until the entire place seems softened and erased. Edges blur, distances lie. What should be close looks far away, and what should be far seems suddenly near. Visitors describe the fog as strangely heavy. Not just something seen, but something felt. A damp veil that presses against the skin, cool and quiet, reducing the world to the sound of water moving through stone. On those fog-bound days, Mistville Lock is almost peaceful. On fog-bound nights, it becomes unsettling. The lock gates stand like two dark shapes in a pale sea, half hidden, half revealed. The river reflects no stars. The moonlight does not shine cleanly. It scatters, faint and uncertain, turning everything into layers of gray. Even familiar footpaths lose their certainty, and the air carries an unnatural silence, like the land is holding its breath. This is when people begin to notice the figures. Not clearly, not at first. A shape at the edge of the fog, standing where the walkway should be empty. A silhouette that seems too tall, too thin, too still. It does not wave or call out. It simply exists, as if the mist has chosen a human outline to wear for a moment. Some see one figure, others see several, spaced apart along the gates as if keeping watch. They appear without sound, without footsteps, without any disturbance of the fog around them. It is as though they are not entering the scene, but forming inside it. Hikers who visit Mistville Lock after sunset often mention the same detail. The figures move silently across the gates, not stumbling, not cautious, but steady, smooth, deliberate. They cross the narrow structures above the water without touching the rails. Their arms do not swing like a walking person's. Their bodies do not shift or balance as they move. They glide forward as if the fog itself is carrying them, pushing them along the lock with quiet intention. Those who watch too long find themselves frozen, unable to decide whether to step back or step closer. The mind searches for explanations. A late worker, another hiker, a trick of light and mist, a misjudged distance. But the longer the figures remain, the harder it becomes to pretend they are ordinary. Because sometimes the figures stop. They turn their heads, slowly, toward the observer. And even without seeing eyes, even without facial detail, the visitor feels the weight of attention. A direct awareness, like someone has noticed them from across a room. Then, as silently as they appeared, the figures step into the thicker fog and vanish, leaving the gates empty and the walkway bare. At Mistville Lock, the fear is not sharp. It is gradual. It settles in the chest like cold water, and it grows deeper the longer you stay. Many hikers report another sensation that arrives without warning, a sudden cold pressing against them. It is not the normal drop in temperature you would expect near water at night. It is specific, concentrated, and immediate. Some describe it as a wall of chill air that meets them head. Say it feels like invisible hands pushing lightly against their shoulders and back, guiding them away from the gates. It can happen while walking. It can happen while standing still. It can happen in the middle of a breath, turning the inhale into a shallow gasp. One moment the air feels damp but manageable. The next, the cold arrives like a message. You do not belong here. And it is not only cold. It is pressure, a quiet force that makes the body tense, makes the skin tighten, makes the heart beat faster without reason. Even people who believe they are calm, who believe they are not, easily startled, often find themselves stepping back before they realize they have decided to retreat. Some hikers say the cold follows them for several steps, keeping pace, hovering at shoulder height, until they move far enough from the lock that the air becomes ordinary again. Others feel it only once, a single brush of freezing presence, like something passed straight through them. A few report that the cold lingers in their clothes, as if the chill has soaked into fabric, refusing to warm even after they return to a car or a home. The atmosphere at Mistville Lock does not rely on sound, but some visitors do describe a strange, quiet rhythm beneath the silence, a soft drip that seems to steady, a distant splash that comes from the wrong direction, from the wooden platform when nobody is walking on it. Nothing loud enough to prove anything, but enough to keep the mind alert, scanning the fog for shapes that might form again. Yet the most disturbing detail may be the shadows. Under dim moonlight, shadows normally fall in simple ways. They stretch away from objects, long and thin, becoming darker where light is blocked. They should be predictable, tied to the physical world. At Mistville Lock, shadows behave differently. They stretch unnaturally, forming where nothing stands. They lean across the stones like tall figures bending toward the water. Sometimes they move against the direction of the moonlight, sliding sideways, as if pushed by a force the eye cannot see. A visitor might look down at the walkway and notice a shadow crossing their path. But when they look up, there is nothing to cast it. The rails stand empty. The gates are still. The fog drifts, slow and thick, as if unaware of the darkness it is shaping. Some hikers claim that their own shadows do not match their movements. A raised hand does not create the right shape on the ground. A step forward creates a delay, as if the shadow is a second behind, slow to follow. It leaves them with a sudden, unsettling question. If the shadow is not truly yours, then what is it? Mistville Lock is not famous in the way grand landmarks are famous. There are no crowds, no bright signs, no constant noise of visitors. It exists quietly, doing its job, holding water in place, guiding boats through, dividing the river into controlled levels. But fog changes the personality of the world. Fog makes familiar places unfamiliar. It hides distance and erases detail. It turns the mind inward, forcing imagination to fill gaps that the eye cannot solve. And at Mistville Lock, those gaps seem to fill themselves. Figures cold, shadows that do not behave. It all feels less like a haunting meant to frighten, and more like an atmosphere that has always been there, waiting for the right conditions to show itself. The lock does not chase people away. It does not roar or threaten. It simply becomes colder, quieter, heavier, until the visitor feels the natural urge to leave. And when they finally turn and walk back into the safer darkness of the path, they often glance over their shoulder one last time. Through the fog, Mistville Lock is barely visible, just a faint outline of gates and stone and water. But sometimes, in the thinnest layer of mist, there is a shape standing on the far side of the lock, watching from where no one should be, not moving, not waving, only present, as the fog rolls on, steady and patient, hiding whatever else might be waiting beneath its veil. Ashen Lock sits in a bend of the river where the current slows down, as if the water itself remembers how to wait. Long ago, this place was a working throat of industry. Barges lined up with heavy loads. Ropes snapped tight. Men shouted over the grinding of gears. The gates rose and fell all day, swallowing vessels and releasing them again, like clockwork. Now the lock is abandoned. The old timbers have faded to gray. Rust has crawled across the ironwork. Moss spreads where boots once stamped. The platforms stand open to the sky, empty, yet strangely preserved, as if the next shift could return at any moment. People still come here, of course. Curious hikers, photographers, travelers who like forgotten places. They park at the cracked roadside pull-off and follow the narrow path down through reeds and brush. The air grows cooler as they approach the water. The scent changes to damp stone, wet wood, and something faintly metallic, like cold chains left in rain. At first, Ashen Loch seems only quiet. Then the silence begins to feel organized. Footsteps appear where no one is walking. Not loud, not frantic. Slow, measured steps, moving across the platforms with the patience of routine. The sound travels cleanly in the open air, echoing off the gate walls and returning as if the lock is answering itself. Visitors stop and listen, trying to locate where it comes from. Some step aside, expecting another group to round the corner. But the path stays empty, and the footsteps continue anyway. When the wind is right, other sounds arrive, a soft clinking, like chains being lifted and lowered. Not a single rattle, but a rhythm, repeated with purpose. It reminds people of work being done carefully, without hurry, without mistake. The kind of sound you would hear if a crew had done the same job every day for years, and their hands could perform it, even in darkness. Some visitors say it starts near the gates, right where the metal mechanisms still sit half buried in rust. Others say it comes from the center channel, hovering above the water, like a memory that never sank. Then there are the splashes. Not the random splash of fish. Not the playful slap of waves against stone. These sounds are wrong, in a way that is difficult to explain. They come in odd intervals, as if something heavy is stepping into shallow water, then stepping out again. A pause, another splash, a slow drip, like water falling from something that has been submerged and lifted. People lean over the railing, scanning the dark surface for movement. They see only their own reflections, bending and breaking. Ashen Loch does not advertise its secrets. It offers them gradually, like fog thickening on a road. The first time someone sees the figures, it is usually by accident. A visitor turns their head toward the far platform and notices a shape standing there, near the old mooring posts. For a second, it looks like an ordinary person, someone dressed too warmly, maybe in an old-fashioned coat, someone waiting. But when the visitor looks again, the shape is farther along, moving with a slow, steady gait, and it is not alone. Sometimes there are two, sometimes three. Their clothing seems out of place, heavy fabric and worn hats, silhouettes that belong to a different century. Their posture is rigid, their arms angled as if gripping ropes, balancing loads, guiding a weight that cannot be seen. The strangest detail is what they carry. Nothing. No crates, no sacks, no barrels, yet their shoulders dip slightly, as if burdened. Their steps land with the dull certainty of people hauling cargo they cannot afford to drop. They walk the platforms in a straight line, crossing the gate area with the focus of workers who know exactly where they are going. And when they reach the end, they do not turn back. They simply fade into the air. Not like a trick, not like smoke, but like a scene losing its light. Most who witness it freeze in place, not because they are certain of what they saw, but because their instincts insist something has passed through the world without asking permission. The loch becomes colder after that. Not a dramatic cold, not a sudden frost. It is the kind of cold that settles into your wrists and throat, the kind that makes you breathe shallowly without realizing it. A quiet pressure, a warning that does not shout. People begin to notice other changes too. Their voices seem smaller, swallowed by the open space. Their footsteps feel too loud, like they are intruding. Even their phone screens seem bright and wrong against the old stone. Some leave quickly, others stay, pulled by the same hunger that draws people toward shipwrecks, empty stations, burned-out houses. The need to understand what is missing. Ashen Loch was built to control the river, to tame it into schedules and measurements. It was designed for movement, for passage, for profit. But abandonment does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means the work never truly ended. As evening falls, the loch takes on a bruised color. The stone walls darken. The water turns thick and reflective, holding the dim sky like a sheet of black glass. This is when the echoes become most convincing. A long scrape, as if a gate is shifting against its hinge. A low groan in the metal, deep enough to be felt more than heard. Then the chains again, clinking softly, answering a motion that no living hand began. A visitor may tell themselves it is only wind, only settling wood, only imagination. But the sounds do not behave like weather. They behave like routine. One final detail follows people when they leave. They walk back up the path, away from the water, toward their cars and the safer noise of the world. And for a moment, they feel relief. Then they hear it behind them. Footsteps, not distant echoes across stone, but steps on the dirt path, keeping the same pace, matching their rhythm, close enough to suggest company, yet far enough to deny proof. When they stop, the steps stop. When they move again, the steps return. A quiet companion that will not show its face. Most people do not run. They simply walk faster, pretending calm, refusing to look back. They unlock their car doors with shaking fingers, slide inside, and breathe out like they have escaped something that did not chase them, but did not need to. In the rearview mirror, Ashen Lock shrinks into the trees. The river remains, patient and dark, and the abandoned gates stand where they always have, waiting for barges that will never return, while figures in old clothing continue their silent labor, carrying invisible cargo through a place that refuses to forget what it was built to do. Ghost River Lock sits where the river bends sharply, forcing the water to slow, turn, and gather itself before continuing downstream. From above, it looks harmless, a narrow channel, old stone walls, a chamber carved into the riverbank like a careful cut. Trees crowd the edges, their branches leaning over the water as if they are listening. But anyone who walks down to the lock for the first time feels it, a change in the air that does not match the weather, a quiet pressure in the silence, the sense that the bend in the river is also a bend in time. This lock was built for work, not beauty. It was made to move barges through the turning current, to lift and lower them with patient engineering. For years, crews came and went, ropes tightened, levers groaned, metal rang against metal. The chamber filled, drained, filled again, day after day, until the motions became routine. Now, the routine remains, even when the workers do not. Visitors arrive in small numbers. Some come for photographs, some come for the history. Some come because they heard stories and wanted to laugh at them. They usually stop laughing before they reach the water. The path dips into shade. The ground becomes damp and soft. The smell of the river thickens, carrying wet stone, moss, and something faintly mechanical, like old iron waking up after a long sleep. At the bend, the river looks different than it does upstream. The current circles gently, folding back on itself. The surface seems darker, not because it is deeper, but because it reflects less light than it should. And right beside it, the lock chamber waits, empty, open, quiet. At least, it appears quiet. The first sound is often the whistle. It is distant at first, barely more than a thin note stretched across the air. Most people mistake it for wind slipping through reeds. But it does not fade like wind. It holds its tone, then drifts downward, like a signal sent from somewhere beyond the bend. Some visitors look up, expecting to see a train line, a road, a boat. There is nothing. Then, minutes later, the whistle returns, slightly closer, slightly clearer, still distant, still unreachable, like a memory of travel passing through the present without stopping. After the whistle comes the creak. It does not come from the trees or the branches. It comes from the lock itself. A slow, strained sound, like a lever shifting under weight, like wood and metal disagreeing, then giving in. Visitors often turn toward the mechanism platform, where old control posts sit half-rusted. Some locks still have their levers in place, frozen in position, stiff with age. But at Ghost River Lock, those levers do not always stay still. There are nights when people swear they see them move. Not a sudden snap, not a violent jerk. A slow pull, the way a tired arm might lift and lower something it has lifted 1,000 times before. Just enough to make the metal complain. Just enough to suggest a hand that is not there. The sound is unmistakable. A long creak, followed by a soft clunk, as if a latch has found its slot. The chamber, even when empty, responds to this phantom motion. Water shifts along the walls. Ripples appear where the surface should be smooth. A faint splash touches the stone, like something unseen stepped too close to the edge. Sometimes, Visitors hear footsteps. They echo strangely in the chamber, bouncing from wall to wall until direction becomes impossible to track. The steps might be above, then beside, then behind, as if the lock is carrying the sound around like a secret. People try to test it. They stop walking, hold their breath, and listen. And the footsteps continue, slow, measured, patient. Then they stop, as if whatever was moving has noticed it is being observed. That is when the figures begin to appear. They do not announce themselves. They are simply there, gathered along the bank, standing where the reeds are thickest and the shadows are deepest. At first, they look like ordinary silhouettes. A person watching the water. Someone with their hands in their pockets, waiting for a companion. But then one figure becomes two, then three, then more. Spaced out along the river's edge like an old crew waiting for instructions. They never wave. They never speak. They watch. In the locked chamber itself, the figures look different. They stand lower than the bank, surrounded by stone walls, their outlines sharpened by the tight space. Their forms appear dim, like shapes seen through fogged glass. Some seem to wear heavy coats. Some appear to have hats, or collars raised high. Their details are never clear enough to be certain, yet the feeling they produce is immediate. These are not random shadows. These are people who belong to this place. A visitor may blink, look away, and look back. The chamber is empty again, or the figures have shifted, now positioned closer to the gates, as if preparing for an arrival no living person can see. One of the most unsettling moments happens when the whistle returns. Longer this time, deeper, filled with distance and longing. The river at the bend reacts as if it has been summoned. The current tightens. The surface trembles. The reflections distort, stretching into shapes that do not match the trees above. In that moment, the lock feels active, not repaired, not restored, but awake. The lever creaks again, and the chamber seems to accept it like a command. Water slides along the walls, then pulls away, as if the lock is beginning a cycle it has not been asked to perform in years. Visitors step back without thinking, their bodies reacting faster than their minds. Some lift their phones to record, but the screens show only darkness and glare. Some whisper to one another, but their voices feel too loud, too alive, too modern for the heavy air surrounding the chamber. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ends. The whistle fades into nothing. The lever falls still. The water calms, and the figures are gone. Only the lock remains, silent again, as if it never moved at all. People often leave Ghost River Lock with confusion more than fear. They try to explain what happened with logic, with weather, with imagination. But even their explanations sound thin when spoken aloud. Because the lock does not feel like a place inventing stories. It feels like a place remembering them. The river bend continues its slow turn, guiding water through the same curve, hour after hour, day after day. The chamber sits ready, carved into stone like a waiting mouth, and in the quiet, beneath the ordinary sounds of insects and wind, the old rhythm lingers. A whistle too distant to locate. A lever that creaks without touch. Figures that appear along the banks and inside the chamber, watching the river as if they are waiting for one more barge to come around the bend, heavy with unseen cargo, returning to a route that never truly ended. Hollow Gates Lock stands like a forgotten checkpoint between two worlds, where the river narrows and the land rises on either side, forcing every passing vessel to slow down and submit to the walls of stone and wood. Even from a distance, the gates command attention. They are taller than most people expect, built heavy and imposing, reinforced with iron bands that have darkened with age. Swollen from decades of water pressure, marked with long scars where ropes once rubbed the surface raw. Moss clings to the seams, as if nature is trying to stitch the gates shut. Travelers often describe the first moment they see them as a moment of pause. Not because the gates are beautiful, but because they feel watchful. Like a barrier that was designed to control more than water. In the days when the lock was fully alive, those gates opened and closed with a force that could not be argued with. Workers moved with strict routines. Signals were given. Orders were passed along. The chamber filled. The water rose. The gate shifted. And the world on the other side became accessible. Now the lock sits quiet for long stretches of time, with no official crew and no steady traffic. But Hollow Gate's lock is not truly empty. Visitors arrive with cameras and curiosity, stepping carefully along damp stone paths. The air near the chamber often feels colder than the surrounding woods, even in daylight. The river here carries a low sound, a steady movement that feels less like water and more like slow breathing. As people approach the gate platform, they begin to notice small details that do not match the calm. A faint scrape against wood, a soft thud, as if something pressed and released. Then, sometimes, the sound of hands, not clapping, not tapping, the sound of palms and fingers gripping wet wood, tightening as if preparing to pull. The first reports of ghostly hands at Hollow Gate's lock came from late evening visitors, when the sun dropped low and shadows stretched along the chamber walls. They described seeing pale shapes appear along the gate edges, fingers curled around the timber beams as if holding on for balance. At first, these hands looked like tricks of light, the grain of the wood forming strange patterns, water reflecting upward, mist gathering in the corners. But then the hands moved. Not fast, not dramatic. A slow tightening, like muscles remembering work. Fingers shifting their grip. Knuckles pressing into the damp surface. Sometimes a hand appeared lower down, just above the waterline, as if someone unseen was bracing themselves against the rising current. Visitors often freeze when it happens. Their minds search for rational explanations, even as their eyes refuse to look away. A hand does not belong there, and yet it remains, holding the wood as if it has always been part of the lock. The air around the gates seems to change when the hands appear. The sound of the river becomes sharper. The chamber feels deeper. Even the space between the walls feels more crowded, as if invisible bodies are standing where bodies once stood. That is when the voices begin. They are never loud. No clear shouting, no sudden screams. Instead, the lock fills with faint commands and murmurs, carried on the damp air like breath in the dark. Visitors report hearing words that almost make sense. Short phrases, broken instructions. The tone of urgency without clarity. A steady stream of low speech that sounds like workers coordinating a task, repeating the same order until it is done correctly. Some hear it from behind them, near the stone walkway. Some hear it from the opposite wall, where sound can hide and return distorted. And some hear it directly from the gates themselves, as if the wood has learned to speak with the voices pressed into it over decades. When people try to listen closely, the murmurs shift away, the words slip out of reach, leaving only rhythm and intent. It becomes less like language and more like a memory of language, the echo of authority trapped inside a routine. Then the shadows move. Shadows at Hollow Gates lock behave differently than they do anywhere else along the river. They do not simply stretch with the sun or drift with clouds. They slide along the walls and waterline as if they are following paths. A visitor might see one glide across the stone beside the chamber, low and narrow, shaped like a person walking close to the edge. Another shadow might climb the gate face itself, traveling upward in a way that no normal shadow should, as if something invisible is stepping onto the wooden beams. Sometimes the shadows gather near the corners of the chamber, where the water swirls gently and leaves small rings against the stone. They thicken there, turning the air darker, like a stain spreading across a surface. And then, without warning, they break apart and vanish, leaving the chamber bright again, as if nothing ever happened. The lock has a way of making visitors doubt themselves. They glance down at the water and see ripples that do not match the wind. They hear a creak from the hinges, even when the gates are still. They feel vibrations beneath their feet, the subtle tremor of a mechanism that should no longer move. On certain nights, people describe an even stranger sensation. They say the chamber feels busy, not visibly crowded, but occupied, as if the air itself is full of workers passing behind them, brushing close without touch, as if the lock is hosting a shift change that no living person can see. Down into the chamber and catch sight of the hands again, more than before. Several sets, gripping along the wood, positioned as if each hand belongs to someone in place, waiting for a signal. Then the murmurs sharpen for a moment. A brief rise in intensity, like a crew preparing for a heavy pull. The shadows glide into position along the waterline, and the gates respond with a low groan, the deep complaint of timber under pressure. For a heartbeat, it feels like the lock is about to open. People hold their breath without realizing it. They wait for the gates to swing, for the chamber to fill, for the unseen workers to finish what they began. But the gates never move far. They only shift slightly, just enough to confirm the sound was real. Then everything releases. The hands fade back into the wood grain. The murmurs break apart into silence. The shadows slide away into ordinary darkness. The chamber returns to still water and cold stone, as if it has shut itself down again. Visitors leave hollow gates, locked with a strange heaviness in their chest, like they have witnessed labor that never ended, duty that outlived the bodies who performed it. The river continues to pass through the bend, calm and steady, as if nothing unusual ever happens here. But the gates remain tall and imposing, standing where they were built to stand, holding back water, holding back time, and waiting for the next invisible command to echo through the chamber once again. Rusted iron lock sits in a stretch of river where the banks tighten and the water moves as if guided by invisible rails. In the daytime, it looks tired, almost harmless. The iron gates are stained orange and brown, their surfaces rough with corrosion, their edges pitted from decades of weather. But at night, the lock changes. It does not become louder or brighter. It becomes aware. The air around it grows heavier, and the silence feels arranged, as if the place is listening for something to return. The iron gates rise like dark teeth on either side of the chamber. Rust clings to every bolt and hinge, yet the structure still holds its shape with stubborn strength. Metal walkways stretch across the top, narrow paths with grated floors that once echoed with boots, tools, and hurried footsteps. Now those walkways are empty, but the echoes remain. Visitors usually arrive before sundown, hoping to explore while there is still light. They come with flashlights, cameras, and quiet excitement, expecting nothing more than an abandoned piece of history. The first thing they notice is the smell. Old metal has a scent that is sharp and cold, like rain hitting steel. Mixed with river dampness, it creates an atmosphere that feels industrial even when the machinery no longer runs. As darkness settles, the rusted gates seem to deepen in color. They absorb the last light and hold it, turning the locked chamber into a shadowed corridor. That is when people begin to hear the walking. It starts high above, on the metal walkway, a slow pattern of steps, steady and deliberate, crossing from one side to the other. The sound travels through the iron framework, vibrating along the rails and support beams like a signal. Visitors often look up immediately, expecting to see another group ahead of them. But the walkway is empty. The steps continue anyway, moving across the grated floor with a weight that feels unmistakably human. Not the random tapping of debris, not the scattered scurry of animals. A calm, measured pace, as if someone is inspecting the lock the way a night watchman once did. Some visitors stand perfectly still, holding their breath. The footsteps stop too, as if whatever is above has noticed the attention. Then the steps begin again, slower this time, and closer to the center of the walkway, directly over the chamber where the water waits below. That is when the figures appear. They are rarely clear. Most of the time they look like dark shapes against darker metal, moving where a person could walk, yet giving off a presence that feels heavier than a shadow. A figure crosses the walkway from left to right, passing behind a rusted support beam. For a brief second it seems solid, with the outline of shoulders and the head tilted slightly forward, the posture of someone focused on a task. Then it reaches the far side and fades into the night, leaving only the cold frame of iron. Sometimes a second figure follows. Sometimes there are more. They do not rush. They walk as if time does not matter, as if the lock belongs to them and always will. Then comes the touch. This is what unsettles visitors the most, because it does not feel like sound or sight. It feels personal. A cold pressure appears on a shoulder, light but unmistakable, as if a hand has rested there for balance. Some describe it as a tap, gentle and brief. Others say it lingers, like fingers pressing through fabric. Visitors turn quickly, certain someone is standing close behind them. No one is there. The walkway above remains silent, Yet the air around the lock seems filled with movement that cannot be seen. Some visitors feel the cold touch again, this time on the opposite shoulder, as if something unseen is circling them, guiding them away from the chamber edge. A few people report feeling the same touch near the back of the neck, like a warning delivered without words. Then the lantern lights appear. Rusted iron lock is dark at night, far from street lamps or buildings. That is why the lights feel so impossible when they happen. A small glow forms near the walkway railing, a warm point of light that flickers once, then steadies. It resembles an old lantern flame, soft and golden, not harsh like a flashlight. Visitors stare at it, confused, expecting to see someone holding a lamp, but the glow hangs alone, suspended near the iron bars. It drifts a short distance, as if carried by a careful hand, then pauses above the center of the chamber. For a moment, it illuminates the rusted texture of the gates, the worn patterns on the rails, and the wet shine on the stone walls below. Then it vanishes, not slowly fading like a dying bulb, but disappearing as if it was never there at all. A minute later, another light appears, lower this time, near the far platform. It flickers twice, throws a brief arc of glow across the water, and then snaps out again. Visitors begin to question their own senses. They check their cameras, their phones, the reflections in the river. But the lock offers no clear proof. Only the feeling that a routine is still happening in the dark. Footsteps above, cold touches below, lantern lights that come and go, like signals between workers who no longer breathe. In the end, most visitors leave quietly. They walk back to their cars without speaking much, as if words might disturb something that has been patiently watching. Rusted iron lock remains behind them, corroded and silent in appearance, yet strangely alive in the night. The iron gates stand closed, the walkways stretch across empty air, and the river continues to move through the chamber like it always has. But when darkness settles again, the lock seems to remember its old life, and the shadows return to their work, walking the metal paths, lifting invisible lanterns, and placing cold hands on shoulders as gently as a warning. Shadow Creek Lock rests in a quiet stretch of water where the river slows and the trees lean inward, forming a tunnel of shade even in the middle of the day. From a distance, it looks like a simple structure: old stone walls, damp platforms, and a narrow chamber carved into the bank. But what makes this lock different is the creek. A small creek feeds into the chamber from the side, slipping through reeds and roots as if it is trying not to be noticed. The water it brings is colder than the river, darker too, stained with mud and leaf rot from the woods upstream. It enters the lock with a constant whispering rush, creating ripples that never fully stop. Locals say the creek has always been strange. It changes its sound without warning. Sometimes it gurgles softly, other times it hisses like breath through teeth. And at night, when the river grows still, the creek becomes the loudest thing in the valley, like it is speaking into the stone walls. Shadow Creek Lock was built for practical reasons. Barges once passed through, using the chamber to rise and fall with the water level. Workers operated the gates by hand, pulling levers and locking gears with routines that left no room for mistakes. The lock kept trade moving and brought life to the riverbank. Then time moved on. Traffic slowed, maintenance stopped. The place became a landmark for hikers and photographers, a forgotten machine standing in wet silence. But the creek never stopped feeding into the lock, and the lock never stopped listening. Visitors come most often near sunset, when the light turns gold and the stone walls cast long shadows across the water. They walk carefully along slick platforms, pausing to take pictures of moss-covered steps and rusted rings bolted into old timber. At first, the atmosphere feels calm. Then the creek draws their attention. It runs in from the side like a narrow black ribbon, making the water in the chamber swirl in a slow pattern that does not match the river's current. People stare at it longer than they meant to, almost hypnotized by the movement. That is when the figures appear along the banks. They often show up as silhouettes between trees, standing where the undergrowth is thickest. Shapes that look like people watching from a distance. A tall outline near the bend. A smaller one closer to the creek mouth. Sometimes two figures appear at once, spaced apart as if they are waiting in place. Visitors usually assume they are other hikers, until they realize the figures are not moving normally. They do not shift their weight. They do not step forward or turn away. They simply remain silent and still, as if they belong to the landscape. Then, without warning, one of them moves. Not by walking, but by sliding a few feet closer, like a shadow dragged across the ground. It changes position too smoothly, without the natural rhythm of legs and footsteps. When a visitor blinks, the figure is closer again, and when they look away, even for a second, it is closer still. Inside the chamber, the water reacts. Ripples form in circles that expand outward, even when no wind touches the surface. The reflections of trees tremble and break. The creek's dark flow seems to spread into the loch like ink dispersing in a glass. This is when some people see figures in the water. At first it looks like the river is simply playing tricks, changing its surface shape, folding light into strange patterns. But then, a form rises just beneath the surface, not breaking through, only moving under the water, as if something is wading slowly across the chamber floor. A visitor might spot a line of darker water traveling from the creek mouth toward the center. Then another. They move like bodies, not like currents. Steady, slow, deliberate. Sometimes the figures pause beneath the surface and remain motionless, as if they are listening to. And then, there are the eyes. People who see them struggle to describe them clearly. The glow is faint, not bright enough to light the chamber, but bright enough to be unmistakable. 2 points beneath the surface, appearing deep in the creek-fed darkness where the water looks almost bottomless. The eyes do not flicker like reflections. They hold steady. They rise slightly, then sink again, as if something below is adjusting its position and watching the visitors from an angle. Most people step back instinctively. Some kneel near the edge, drawn by a powerful urge to confirm what they saw. But the moment they lean closer, the water shifts and the glow disappears. Then the whispers begin. At Shadow Creek Loch, sound carries strangely. The stone walls reflect even the smallest noise, bouncing it across the chamber until it feels like it comes from every direction. The creek adds its own constant hiss, blending into a background that can hide soft speech. Visitors describe the whispers as thin and careful, like someone talking just above the waterline. At first they sound like ordinary murmurs, impossible to understand, like distant conversation carried on wind. But then something changes. The whispers begin to form names. Not shouted, not clearly spoken, but shaped with intention. A visitor hears their own name, drifting across the chamber as if it was called from the opposite wall. They turn quickly, confused, expecting a friend nearby. No one is speaking. Another visitor hears a name that belongs to someone in their group, a cousin, a friend, a partner, a name that should only be spoken by someone who knows them. The whisper arrives again, slightly closer and slightly slower, as if it wants the person to answer. Some people respond without thinking, calling back into the shadows. The loch offers no reply, only the creek's steady rush and the subtle movement beneath the surface, as if the water itself has leaned forward to listen. Those who come here often feel an invisible pressure, not violent, but persuasive. A quiet pull toward the chamber edge, toward the darker water fed by the creek. The sensation is not like being pushed. It is like being invited. A visitor might take one step forward without realizing it, then another. Their eyes fix on the creek mouth, where the water enters like a narrow tunnel. The shadows around it deepen, and the figures along the bank seem to turn their attention toward the chamber. The whispers return, speaking names again, softer this time, almost gentle. The glowing eyes appear briefly beneath the surface, just long enough to confirm that something is still watching. In that moment, Shadow Creek Loch feels less like an abandoned structure and more like a living boundary. A place where water collects more than leaves and silt. A place where the past does not vanish, but gathers. Then, suddenly, everything releases. The figures along the bank fade into the trees, dissolving into ordinary darkness. The shapes beneath the surface drift away, leaving only ripples that quickly smooth out. The glowing eyes vanish like a lamp shut off underwater. The whispers break apart into nothing but the creek's constant hiss. Visitors often leave without saying much. They walk back along the path as if they are trying not to attract attention. Some keep glancing over their shoulders, expecting to see someone behind them, keeping pace. But the lock stays still. Only the creek continues to feed into it, whispering through reeds and roots, pouring cold water into the chamber as it always has. And when night settles fully, Shadow Creek Lock waits again, quiet and dark, while figures return to the banks, glowing eyes open beneath the surface, and unseen voices carry across the water, calling the names of those who came too close. Broken Beam Lock sits on a quiet stretch of water where the river narrows and bends through tall reeds and old trees. From the road it is barely visible, hidden behind brush and leaning fences, but those who know the path can find it easily. The stones of the chamber still hold their shape, but the wooden framework above tells a different story. Time has pulled it downward. The beams sag like tired shoulders. Planks bow slightly over the gaps. Iron bolts stand out like dark scars, holding wood together that no longer trusts its own strength. Even in daylight, the structure seems strained, always on the edge of a slow collapse that never quite happens. And when the wind moves through the lock, it does not sound like wind. It sounds like the lock is breathing. Broken Beam Lock was once a working passage, built to guide barges through changes in water level with careful control. The timber beams were meant to carry weight, absorb pressure, and keep the moving parts steady. For years, the lock would have been loud with practical noise. Water rushing into the chamber, boots crossing platforms, tools clinking, signals shouted over the creak of lifting gates. Now the lock stands mostly abandoned, and yet it never feels empty. Visitors come for different reasons. Some come for history, wanting to see the craftsmanship of older engineering. Some come to take photos of weathered wood and mossy stone. Others come because they have heard stories and want to test them with their own senses. The first step onto the platform usually brings silence. Then the second step brings the creak. The wood responds immediately, not as a simple squeak, but as a long, low groan that travels along the beams and disappears into the hollow space beneath. It is a sound with depth, as if the lock is answering the visitor, acknowledging their arrival. People instinctively slow down after that. They place their feet more carefully, listening to how the structure reacts. The planks feel slightly springy, the way old wood does when it has taken in too much water over too many seasons. Above, the beams hang overhead like ribs. Some are cracked, some are darkened, some appear twisted, as if the lock once took a heavy hit from a flood or a collision and never fully recovered. The whole structure seems held together by stubbornness and time-worn habit. And then the drafts begin. Visitors describe them as icy, even on warm nights. A cold stream of air sliding along the walkway, curling around ankles, brushing the back of the neck. Not the broad chill of open water, but narrow and deliberate, like a breath aimed at a specific person. A visitor might turn their head, certain someone just walked behind them. No one is there. They move forward, and the cold follows. It slips through the gaps between beams, threading through places where there should be no wind at all. It pours out of the chamber like the lock is exhaling, and for a moment the air smells sharper, like wet timber and old metal waking up. That is when the figures appear. At Broken Beam Lock, they are not always seen in open spaces. They appear within the structure itself, moving between the beams as if they belong inside the frame. A visitor might notice a shadow passing behind a support post, too tall to be a branch, too steady to be shifting light. Another might see a shape crossing above the chamber, stepping along a beam that should not be safe to walk on. The figures rarely look human in detail. They are silhouettes in motion, just enough to confirm that something is moving where nothing should move. Sometimes they travel in a straight line, crossing the platform with purpose, like workers making their rounds. Other times they appear to drift, sliding through the beams and vanishing behind the sagging timber, as if the lock has layers of space that do not match the visible world. Visitors often look directly at the place where the figure disappeared. The beams are empty, the platform is still, and yet the feeling remains, heavy and close, like someone is standing just out of sight. The lock does not stay quiet for long. As the evening deepens, the creaks become more frequent. They do not match the movement of visitors. A plank groans, even when no one steps on it. A beam complains, with a slow crackle, like wood shifting under invisible weight. The sound travels through the structure and settles in the stone walls, bouncing softly through the chamber like a distant warning. Then comes the chains. Not every visitor hears them, but those who do never forget the sound. It starts as a faint swing, metal against metal, a gentle clinking that rises and falls with a steady rhythm. The lock has old hooks and rings where ropes and chains once hung, and the sound seems to come from that history. But there is no chain moving, no loose metal striking another piece by chance. The sound continues anyway, swinging as if something unseen is pulling it back and forth. Sometimes it speeds up for a moment, as if the chain is being dragged or lifted. Then it slows again, returning to that steady sway, like a pendulum marking time. Visitors search for the source, shining flashlights into corners and underbeams. They find rusted fittings, broken hardware, and water stains, but nothing that could explain a moving chain. The icy draft returns stronger, sliding across shoulders and faces, pushing through the hollow frame like a cold current through a tunnel. The figures begin to appear closer now. One crosses the far side of the platform, moving through a gap between beams where a person could not fit. Another passes through the chamber opening, its outline briefly visible against the dark water below. A third shape appears overhead, standing on a sagging beam as if testing its strength. The beam answers with a long, strained creak. And for a moment, the entire lock feels loaded with weight, like it is carrying more than wood should carry. Visitors often describe a strange sensation at this point, as if the lock is repeating an old night shift. Invisible workers moving through the framework, chains swinging in routine, cold drafts flowing like breath between tasks. The place feels busy, but silent. A person may feel the urge to whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb something fragile. Another might feel watched, not by eyes, but by attention, as if the lock itself is aware of every movement and every pause. Then, without warning, the chain sound stops. The creaking settles into stillness. The drafts soften and fade. The figures vanish into the beams as if they were never there. Only the river remains below, sliding through the chamber with slow patience. Visitors leave broken beam lock with their shoulders slightly tense, their voices quieter than before. They look back once or twice as they walk away, expecting to see movement inside the frame. But the lock stands in the darkness, sagging and silent, its beams holding their fragile shape. And when night deepens again, the wood begins to creak with no footsteps. Cold air spills through the gaps like unseen breath. Chains swing in the empty spaces, and figures return to move through the broken structure as if the work never truly ended.